Welcome to today's explainer. You know, if you've ever stood shoulder to shoulder in the incredibly crowded Louvre, straining your neck just to catch a glimpse of the most famous painting in the world, you might have felt, well, a tiny pang of disappointment. Because at first glance, sitting there behind bulletproof glass and an absolute sea of smartphones, it kind of lacks the massive dramatic wow factor of other grand Renaissance works. But today, I'm going to ask you to just hit pause on all that noise. We're going to virtually wipe away the crowds, turn down the volume, and reveal the true, meticulous genius that is hiding right there in plain sight. In this explainer, we're dissecting the unbelievable story of how a merchant's wife became a global icon. We're going to explore how the brilliant intersection of art, anatomy, geology, and optical physics completely transformed what really should have been a very ordinary portrait into the greatest psychological painting ever created. It's a piece of art so radically ahead of its time that literally 500 years later, neuroscientists are still trying to figure it out. Now, for a long time, there was intense debate about who the Mona Lisa actually was. But we can absolutely ground this painting in actual documented history. Giorgio Vasari, who is often called the very first art historian, wrote this down in 1550. And a recently discovered eyewitness note from 1503 backs it up. So this isn't a myth. This was a real project, a real woman, and a real commission that Leonardo da Vinci started in Florence. Okay, let's dive into our roadmap for today. We'll start with 1, the merchant's wife. Move to 2, layering light and shadows. Then 3, breaking portraiture rules. 4, the optics of a smile. And we'll wrap up with 5, becoming a global icon.
Chapter 1. The Merchant's Wife, the Ordinary Subject.
This whole thing brings up a really fascinating mystery. By 1503, Leonardo da Vinci was an absolute superstar. He was used to painting for popes and royalty. So, why take on a relatively small commission? Well, let's look at the couple. Francesco was a 30-year-old nouveau riche silk merchant. Lisa Giardini was just 15 when they married, and she came from an old, noble family that had basically lost all its money. Now, sure, family connections played a part. Leonardo's dad was actually Francesco's lawyer, but the likely truth is so much more interesting. Leonardo probably chose this ordinary woman because it gave him freedom. Without some demanding royal patron breathing down his neck, the Mona Lisa became his own personal laboratory to test everything he knew about science and art. And what's really striking here is what's missing. Thanks to Francesco's will, we know for a fact that Lisa owned a massive amount of expensive jewelry. Yet Leonardo painted her completely stripped of high-status symbols. There are no rings, no heavy necklaces, just simple, unadorned hair. Why? Because Leonardo was engineering a very specific experience. He deliberately omitted all that flamboyant wealth you'd normally see in a commissioned portrait to ensure there were absolutely zero visual distractions from her face.
Chapter 2. Layering Light and Shadows, the Science.
Let's look at how this masterpiece was actually built. We're going to get into the microscopic science of Leonardo's obsessive technique, a process that took him 16 whole years to perfect. For a painting with such a massive cultural footprint, it is surprisingly tiny, just 30 by 21 inches. But the physical buildup? It's staggering. He started with a thin grain of poplar wood, then laid down a highly reflective lead-white undercoat. Over that went a transparent, toned ground called imprimatura. And then came the absolute magic, up to 30 microscopic layers of colored glazes. He used these glazes almost like a wash. The genius of this is that the lead-white undercoat reflects light back up through all those transparent layers. It literally lights the Mona Lisa from within. And here is a totally mind-blowing statistic. If you add up all 30 of those individual layers of glaze, they total just 40 micrometers thick. That is literally half the width of a single human hair. He applied these with tiny, almost invisible brushstrokes, working painstakingly slowly over the years, bending and refracting the light in incredibly unique ways. All of this obsessive layering allowed him to invent a technique called Sfumato, which translates to smoky. Think about it. In real life, our eyes don't see harsh black comic book outlines around objects, so Leonardo flat out refused to paint them. By using Sfumato, especially around the corners of her mouth and her eyes, the edges just sort of gracefully tail away unresolved. There are no hard lines anywhere. It makes her expression perpetually blurry and fuzzy, which is exactly the trick that brings her to life. He paired that sfumato with chiaroscuro, which is the dramatic contrast of light and shadow, to create the illusion of three-dimensional volume. He even used a technique called verdaccio, putting down a green base layer to produce highly nuanced realistic flesh tones.
Actually, if you look at your own hand right now, you'll probably notice some subtle green and blue tones beneath your skin. Leonardo saw that 500 years ago and painted it perfectly.
Chapter 3, Breaking Portraiture Rules, the Revolution.
Let's pull back from those microscopic paint layers for a second and look at the macro composition, because with this one little painting, Leonardo forever changed the rules of art. Before the Mona Lisa, standard portraits of women were super stiff. They were formal profiles showing them looking away, acting serious and aristocratic, usually stuck against a flat wall. But Leonardo, he gives us this beautifully relaxed, three-quarter length pyramid composition. It fills the frame, making it feel incredibly intimate. She's content, she's smiling. And most shockingly for a woman in a Renaissance painting, she is making bold, direct eye contact with you, the viewer.
The background is just as revolutionary. Leonardo pulled this complex landscape straight from his actual geological studies in the Apennine Mountains. He uses aerial perspective, where distant objects get hazier, to create a hyper-realistic illusion of depth. He masterfully connects the microcosm of her human body to the macrocosm of the earth itself. The curves of her hair reflect the rolling rivers behind her, and her torso parallels the twist of the valleys. But here is the real visual trick. Look closely at the horizon line. It's totally mismatched. The left side doesn't line up with the right. Our brains naturally try to correct this skewed horizon, and when we do that, it creates an optical illusion that makes her figure seem to slightly shuffle or move right inside the frame.
Chapter 4. The Optics of a Smile. The Illusion. And that brings us perfectly to the single most famous element of the painting. And let me tell you, it was not a happy accident. This smile was built upon Leonardo's late, gruesome nights in the morgue, literally peeling back the flesh of cadavers just to map the exact origins of every nerve and muscle that forms a human smile. I want you to try something with me right now. Look directly into her eyes. You can sense she is smiling, right? Okay, now shift your focus and look directly at her mouth. The smile suddenly seems to fade into a slight smirk. Shift back up to her eyes, and boom, the smile returns. Why does her smile disappear when you look directly at it? Guys, this is not your imagination playing tricks on you. This is neuroscience. Back in the year 2000, a Harvard neuroscientist named Dr. Margaret Livingston actually solved this mystery. Our eyes have two distinct regions, the fovea, which focuses on sharp central details and colors, and our peripheral vision, which picks up shadows and motion. When you look at her eyes, your peripheral vision is what's looking at her mouth. Because peripheral vision only picks up shadows, it sees Leonardo's smoky sfumato shading at the corners of her lips, creating the distinct curve of a smile. But the very second you look directly at her mouth, your fovea takes over. It's looking for sharp detail, it ignores those soft shadows, and poof, the smile just vanishes. Leonardo, inspired by the 11th century Islamic physicist Alhazen, literally hacked the human visual system half a millennium ago.
And honestly, he didn't stop there. If you're watching this on a big enough screen, try moving slightly to the right and then to the left. You're going to notice her eyes seem to physically follow you. Lisa's eyes are actually painted looking slightly to her left, but because the elements of perspective, light, and shadow are permanently fixed in a two-dimensional plane, they don't change based on where you stand. This absolute masterclass in light refraction ensures her gaze tracks you across the entire room. Chapter 5. Becoming a Global Icon. The Legacy.
Before we wrap up, we absolutely need to address a very persistent modern myth. The idea that the Mona Lisa is only famous today because some petty criminal named Vincenzo Perugio stole her from the Louvre in 1911. The historical timeline easily debunks that. She was recognized as a massive masterpiece right out of the gate. By the year 1800, Napoleon was so completely captivated by her that he hung the painting in his own private bedroom. In 1854, she was the subject of early photography. Guidebooks in the 1870s were already calling her the Louvre's most celebrated work. She was mass-produced and fiercely loved way before 1911. What the theft actually did was just put her on the front page of global newspapers, drawing crowds who wanted to view the empty space on the wall. And later on, her historic 1963 U.S. tour broadcast her into billions of living rooms, completely transforming her into this Andy Warhol-era pop celebrity. The theft definitely amplified her fame, but it certainly didn't invent it.
Leonardo da Vinci once famously said, "Art is never finished, just abandoned." He knew exactly how important this painting was. In fact, he took the Mona Lisa with him when he moved to France in 1516, and he continued to meticulously tinker with those 40 micrometers of glaze right up until his death in 1519. For him, it was the ultimate synthesis of intellect, imagination, human anatomy, and physics. Which leaves us with this final thought for today.
The Mona Lisa is an image so deeply familiar to us now that she's almost been stripped of her original meaning. Does our modern obsession with her celebrity status distract us from truly seeing the masterpiece? I really hope that after today's explainer, the next time you see her face, whether it's scrolling on your phone or standing behind that glass in Paris, you won't just see a famous pop icon. You'll see the unbelievable science, the microscopic layers, the optical illusions, and the quiet, breathtaking genius that Leonardo always intended for you to see. Thanks so much for learning with me today.